to show you how sand dunes form along the coastline. First of all, you need a wide, long, sandy beach area, ideally with lots of light, small-grained sand particles on it. And this is where the sea would be kind of lapping against it. You want a sea that's quite gentle, that's going to bring lots of sand deposition onto this beach environment, not something that's going to be powerful waves, destructive waves, and erode it away, so that sand keeps building up and piling up here. And the other critical ingredient in forming sand dunes is having lots of regular, strong wind from a particular direction blowing onto the land rather than offshore. These winds are going to be very critical in forming sand dunes because sand dunes are all about blowing sand material around. So this beach has got to be quite dry because wet sand doesn't move very easily, and the sand will be moved along by the wind across this beach when it's dry by rolling along the bottom, we call that traction, or by slowly bouncing and hopping along, being lifted briefly by the wind, we call that saltation. And some of the light sand will also be picked up and held in the wind as suspension for a small period of time, and then as the wind speed decreases, it will be dropped and fall back down onto the beach. So there's a combination of factors: the beach material and size, lots of fine sand beach material, gentle waves pushing material onto the beach, and regular strong winds. But that's not all that's required. To form a dune system on a beach, rather than just having a load of sand blowing around, we need something that's going to help the dune to form. So it often starts off with some sort of debris on the beach. That can be some driftwood, or maybe some seaweed, or other litter or material that forms on the beach somewhere, often at the high tide point. Then the wind blows material around, and what would happen is sand will be blown around, and you can see here it piling up around some object on the beach. That's because it's a little bit wetter and stickier, and also because the wind speed will be reduced as it passes around objects. So a little bit of sand, a few grains will be deposited on one side of it, and that slowly builds up over time. Now, a beach is not an easy place for plants to grow, which is why many beaches just have plain sand across them. But in some situations, plants can start to grow on it as this small, tiny dune hill, as it were, starts to form. And these are specialized plants for growing in high wind, high salty environments, because the water here and the groundwater will be quite salty, and it doesn't have very much organic matter in either, as it's mostly just bare sand at this stage. So plants like grasses start to grow here. A specialized type of grass here called marram grass has very long, tall blades of grass that grow here, and very deep root systems that will hold it stable and get water from deeper down, and give it some access to some fresh water. So this type of plant starts to grow on the small ridge that forms along the dune, along the beach. As these plants grow, any wind that blows around it now will start piling up around these grasses, because the grasses will help slow the wind down as it blows around them and catch a lot of the sand. So now we start seeing the sand pile up. Dead plants and roots will decompose into this ridge of sand, forming more organic matter. That changes the chemistry and physical properties of the soil here, starts to form more organic rich soils. More moisture will be held in the soils now, which will mean the salt level has decreased as it catches rainwater in the soils. It's a better condition for plants to grow in, and so we'll see new plants start to form here. So we might see some bushes that can start to invade onto this piece of land and actually take root. So things like gorse and heather are types of bushes that are adapted to grow in this type of environment. And the marram grass starts to be taken over by these larger woody type of bushes here. This change from one plant type, we had marram grass here, changing the conditions, that it grew on top of to let another plant then grow in time on top of it in different conditions is called plant succession. So we can see the plant types changing over time. These plants will themselves change the soil. I've just drawn in front of it another bit of seaweed or driftwood that forms on the beach that seems to be piling up and growing into the sea in this piece of coastline as more sand is blown onto it. And of course what will happen as more sand gets blown around, we'll see sand piling up around where those bushes are on that dune ridge, and a new dune ridge forming. This new dune ridge forming is called an embryo dune. I should have said that earlier. This dune that we had here with the marram grass growing on it, which is a little baby dune, we call an embryo dune. As it piles up with more organic matter and forming these more developed bushes upon it, we start to call it what's called a yellow dune. Right there, it's a much larger dune ridge. And in front of it, I've drawn here, this next pile is another embryo dune just beginning to form. So we could give these dune hills different names as they mature and develop. On the little embryo dune, we're going to get some marram grass growing on top of it, of course, and on the yellow dune, the bushes and gorse and heather and other plants that are growing in it, grasses, will themselves grow and decompose over time through the nutrient cycle, creating richer, more organic soils and making the ridge more kind of compact and permanent, and forming a sort of more developed dune, a larger, more consolidated dune. Over time then, as the soils change and the organic matter builds up, what we'll find is new plants can then grow on top of it, and eventually we'll get to the right conditions for plants like trees to grow on it, which need lots of organic matter, lots of deep, rich, organic rich soils in order for them to grow, and fresh water, plenty of fresh water within the soils for them to access rather than salt water. And this is a very stable condition now. We have a dune where the winds aren't going to very easily blow away any of the sand. There's lots of damp, organic, rich soils beneath the trees and roots holding it all together. And we call this a grey dune or a fixed dune, as it's kind of quite a stable last stage. You can see the dune ridges there, quite large, quite developed. And in front of it is just a little baby embryo dune, which is beginning to form. And over time, of course, that will then evolve to form its own bushes on top of it, heather and gorse, for example. As we see plant succession develop on that dune ridge, more sand will pile up in there, and in front of that, maybe another baby embryo dune will form. So as we've seen this ridge now, as we visit it, we'll see three dune ridges. The small embryo dune just beginning here with the marram grass on it. We see the yellow dune here with the bushes and gorse on it, and then we see the fully developed grey dune here with the trees on it. And each of these represents a different stage, as it were, in succession that's developed over time, because you've got to kind of remember that if we wind the clock back, that our grey dune where the trees were was once just that embryo dune that evolved and changed over time in this manner to eventually form this final more fixed grey dune ridge with a yellow dune in front of it and an embryo dune nearer the sea. Between each dune ridge is a lower bit or dip, which you can see there. We call that a dune slack. A dune slack is going to be a lot lower. It's going to have higher moisture content nearer the groundwater and sea level. So we might see some puddles and lakes and marshes developing in those lower sections, and the higher bits being much drier, and where the other freshwater plants are growing. So that's how dune ridges form. That's what we call dune succession, from just a plain, ordinary flat beach to developing these distinct hills or ridges. They form over sort of decades to hundreds of years or so. So the transformation from that baby embryo dune to a fixed dune may take a couple of hundred years, typically in a place, and it's a continually evolving process. It's a mixture, as you can see here, between the sea bringing sand on shore, winds helping to continue to blow that sand on shore and blow it around, but very importantly also plants growing on the trees blowing on the sand, here, and changing these soil structures over time, creating organic rich soils that then lead to plant succession, different plants growing and stabilizing the dunes and developing a series of dune ridges here. So a whole sequence of elements that are very important and ultimately leading to a dune ridge forming. Now, dunes are a little bit fragile because, as you can imagine, it's the vegetation that's keeping it all stable and held together. And if that vegetation is removed for some reason, that could be by human activity, some sort of disturbance, trampling on it, pulling out plants, driving on top of it, or other such things, then the plants could be removed, and then the sand could start to blow away again quite easily. We call that a blowout, when the bare sand is then blown away from a dune ridge and could remove a dune ridge altogether. So we need to think carefully about how we might protect and look after some of these dunes, because they are quite valuable, important ecosystems, as well as quite useful protection against sea level rise and coastal erosion in places. So have a think about different ways we could try and protect and manage these dunes from any damage from human activity. Okay, so that's an overview about how dunes form.